One summer afternoon, three young brothers set off on a bike ride in rural Iowa and vanished. For more than 2 decades, the town whispered theories and held on to fading hope. Then, in 2023, a demolition crew stumbled upon rusted bikes inside an abandoned grain silo and reopened a mystery buried in corn dust and silence. The heat hung heavy over the flat plains of Rockford, Iowa, on June 8, 2001. It was a Friday afternoon that held no hint of what was to come. The farmers were deep in their fieldwork, the high school let out for summer just days earlier, and the town buzzed with the start of festival season. For the Miller family, it was just another sleepy start to the weekend. And for the three Miller boys, Noah, 12, Eli, 10, and Caleb, 8, it meant a chance to ride their bikes down old gravel roads, free from homework and classroom clocks. Their mother, Jenny, stood on the porch of their faded green farmhouse and waved as the boys pedaled off, shouting something about checking out a beaver dam near the edge of the abandoned Peterson property. They promised to be back before dinner. Their dog Max barked twice before trailing after them, tail wagging. It was the last time anyone saw them. At 5:00 p.m., Jenny began pacing the porch. By 6:15, dinner had gone cold, and the boys hadn't returned. Her calls down the road went unanswered. When her husband Frank got back from the grain co-op and found her pale and panicked, they drove the truck slowly along every road ditch and trail they could think of. By nightfall, the sheriff was notified. A formal search began at 8:47 p.m. The next 48 hours would see every able-bodied resident of Rockford combing through fields, forests, barns, and grain bins. Deputies brought in scent dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, and volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through pastures. But no bikes, no shoes, not even a thread of fabric turned up. It was as though the boys had evaporated into the rows of corn and soybean. Jenny barely slept, staring at the door each night, as though willing it to open. Frank fell into a grim silence, only breaking it to offer curt nods to sheriff's deputies or issue exhausted instructions to search teams. At church that Sunday, Pastor Don McKelvey gathered the town together for a prayer vigil. It was solemn and raw. They lit 3 candles. Some children cried. So did grown men. That night, someone broke into the old Peterson barn and spray-painted "Where Are They" on the wall in red. No one claimed responsibility, and no one erased it. It stayed there for years, a faded cry for answers. By the end of the week, state investigators had taken over. They interviewed the family, neighbors, friends. There were no witnesses, no signs of a struggle, no clear indication the boys had ever reached the beaver dam, or if they even intended to. There was no ransom note, no anonymous call, no hint of foul play, at least not in the traditional sense. The bikes were never found. Neither was Max. Jenny clung to hope, as many mothers do. Every birthday she baked a cake for each of them, placed it in the center of the dining table, and lit candles. Every year she made the same wish. Frank stopped going to church. He spent more time alone in the garage, tinkering with engines that didn't need fixing. The sheriff's department continued to follow leads. In 2002, a man in Missouri was pulled over with Iowa plates and had children's clothing in the trunk. None of it matched the Miller boys. In 2003, a pair of bones were found in the woods outside Shell Rock, animal, not human. In 2004, someone phoned in a tip from Colorado, claiming to have seen 3 boys who looked just like the missing Millers at a gas station. The footage was grainy. The kids were never identified. Each tip reopened the wound. Each disappointment deepened the scar. Still, the town of Rockford didn't forget. Flyers hung in the post office for years. Their elementary school hung their portraits at the front entrance beneath the word "missing." Over time, they yellowed and curled, but no one took them down. As years slipped by, some locals whispered about the old silo near the Peterson land. It had long been sealed shut, a concrete monolith too dangerous to enter its ladder. rusted its hatch welded after a teenager was injured in the 80s. But others insisted it had nothing to do with the boys. It was simply too far, too locked, too unlikely. But for those first days in June 2001, it was simply fear. Pure, suffocating, directionless fear. And silence. Always the silence. By the time a full year had passed, the disappearance of the Miller boys had evolved from a tragedy into a mystery embedded deep into the heart of Rockford. The town's children grew up with the story whispered on schoolyards and retold at slumber parties. Parents clutched their own kids just a little tighter. Jenny and Frank were never the same. Grief hollowed them out in different ways. Jenny took up gardening with mechanical focus, her backyard slowly transforming into a meticulous, haunting display of wildflowers and winding gravel paths. Frank stopped working at the co-op and took a night shift at the grain elevator in Cedar Falls. He claimed it helped him think. In truth, he simply couldn't stand to see other families living normal lives. They never moved away, not once. If they come back, they need to come home, Jenny would say. Over the years, Frank made it a habit to check the old Peterson property every Sunday evening. He would walk along the fence line occasionally, venturing down toward the rusted silo that sat untouched near the far end of the field. He never broke the lock, never forced the hatch. He just stood there as if listening. 20 years later, in 2021, the Peterson land had changed hands. A company out of Des Moines purchased it and began clearing it for development. Most of the old structures were bulldozed. A massive tractor dug deep trenches through the soil, unearthing forgotten objects. A toy fire truck rusted barbed wire soda cans from the 70s. Still, the silo remained. Its welded hatch discouraged tampering, and the developers weren't interested in pouring the funds into dismantling it. So it sat. Again. Waiting. In the summer of 2023, a severe drought hit much of Iowa, reducing the topsoil to cracked clay and exposing previously buried items all over the region. In Rockford, that meant an uptick in relics, coins, bottle caps, and even a rusted rifle from the early 20th century found near the old fairgrounds. That same summer, a boy named Oliver Jensen, 14 years old and obsessed with urban exploration, wandered onto the Peterson property with two friends. They were armed with flashlights, a drone, and a crowbar. They'd heard the legends about the boys, the silo, the unanswered questions, and dared one another to get inside. Oliver managed to crack open a portion of the lower vent panel with the crowbar. The boys couldn't enter, but they sent the drone through. What they saw made them go pale. Resting against the interior wall, covered in dust and tangled with weeds and rodent nests, were 3 bicycles, 2 blue, 1 red. Their paint had flaked chains, rusted tires flat, but the frame decals still bore the names Noah, Eli, and Caleb written in black permanent marker. Oliver's father turned the footage over to the sheriff within hours. That weekend work began to open the silo under official supervision. The town of Rockford held its breath, unsure whether they wanted answers anymore. Some things, it seemed, were better left beneath the dust. The silo was drained of old grain husks, and beneath the crusted layer at the bottom, authorities found 2 tattered shoes, a scout badge, and a strip of plaid fabric. No bones, no bodies, just echoes. Jenny stood silently behind the police tape as the items were removed. She didn't cry. She only clutched the handle of her garden trowel, which she still carried most days, and whispered, "I knew it." Frank came out of his silence too, but only to say, "Now we know where they went." But not why. The investigation reopened. DNA samples were taken, and the bikes were positively identified. News vans arrived, setting up outside the property, and national attention returned to Rockford for the first time in 2 decades. Theories bloomed like mold in damp soil. Some believed the boys had been lured inside and trapped, either accidentally or by someone else. Others speculated the silo had always been the key, that something sinister had waited inside. The rusted interior walls seemed to offer no answers, only flaking paint and a lingering sense of decay. Then a new question arose. If the boys had entered the silo, how had the hatch still been welded shut when the property changed hands? Who sealed it, and why? Jenny knew her boys. They wouldn't have climbed that silo unless someone told them to, or someone chased them there. She began writing a list of every name she remembered from those days: neighbors, drifters, old substitute teachers, delivery men. No one was safe from her scrutiny. Meanwhile, Frank began checking local storage unit auctions, following a hunch he wouldn't explain. If someone wanted to hide something they took from that silo, he told the sheriff they didn't bury it. They stored it. In late August 2023, Jenny was called to the sheriff's office. They had located an old tin lunchbox in a pawn shop in Mason City, sold by a man who'd recently died of natural causes. Inside the box was a Polaroid photograph, faded and water-stained, of 3 boys seated near a red silo. The date on the photo's margin read June 8, 2001. Jenny didn't speak for a full minute. Then she looked up and said that photo was taken after they left the house. Someone followed them. The sheriff nodded gravely. Whatever had happened that day wasn't just a tragic accident. It had been orchestrated, and the answers had waited 22 years to come loose from the dust. The photograph set off a ripple through the community. Even those who had tried to move on from the tragedy were drawn back into the mystery. Local TV ran a special segment titled "The Silo Clue," and reporters swarmed the Mason City pawn shop, interviewing the elderly clerk who'd accepted the tin box. Frank studied the photo for hours, noting details others missed: the long weeds at the silo's base, a figure in the background blurred by motion, and most notably, the faint silhouette of a dog near the frame's edge. The Millers didn't own a dog, but their neighbor at the time, Ray Halberd, did. A large German shepherd named Duke. Ray had moved away in 2002, shortly after the disappearance. At the time, no one questioned it much. He was a recluse, a mechanic with few friends, and no one wanted to prod a grieving neighbor. But now he looked different in hindsight. Frank remembered Ray had access to welding tools. Jenny recalled Ray's strange comment the week before the boys vanished: "Kids run too free these days. Sooner or later, someone will teach them to stay home." That memory chilled her now. The sheriff's department reopened Ray's file and learned he had passed away in 2017. His belongings had been sold, including a green metal locker which had ended up in a rural antique store. Frank and Jenny drove there immediately. The store owner, recognizing them from the news, led them to the back where the locker still sat. Inside, they found what looked like ordinary junk: old screwdrivers, brittle papers, and a thermos. But under a false bottom panel, duct-taped in place, lay a small stack of photos, more Polaroids. They showed the boys in various settings around Rockford, outside the gas station, near a cornfield by the Peterson barn. One showed Caleb looking frightened. His brothers stood behind him, clutching each other. None of the photos had dates. None showed Ray directly. But in the reflection of a car window, in one image, a figure could be seen holding a camera. A man with a dark beard and overalls. Ray had always dressed like that. The sheriff called in a forensic expert to analyze the photos. It took weeks, but they eventually confirmed the camera model used matched one Ray had owned. Investigators also matched a partial fingerprint from one photo's edge to Ray's employment records. Suddenly, he wasn't just a creepy neighbor, he was the primary suspect in a 22-year-old cold case. But there was a bigger question now. If Ray had been stalking the boys, what had happened on that summer day in 2001? Frank remembered something else. A week before the boys vanished, Ray had come over to borrow a trailer hitch. He returned it 2 days later, said he was going on a fishing trip near the Des Moines River. At the time, it seemed harmless. Digging into archived security footage from a rural bait shop along Ray's supposed route, yes, remarkably, a dusty VHS tape had survived. revealed something unexpected. Ray had indeed stopped there, but he wasn't alone. In the truck bed were 3 bicycles. When police returned to the silo for a deeper investigation, they made a discovery they had somehow missed before. Behind a corroded wall panel, they found a hollow space only about 2 feet deep, sealed crudely with sheet metal. Inside was a bundle of moldy fabric children's clothes carefully folded. One of them was Noah's Cub Scout uniform. It wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a shrine. Jenny stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, trembling when she was told. Why, she asked. Why do that? We think Ray may have tried to keep them, the sheriff said delicately. Or at least he didn't want anyone else to have them. No bodies had been recovered, but authorities now believed that Ray lured the boys to the silo that afternoon, under some false pretense, possibly with a story about kittens or a secret hideout. Once inside, he may have locked them in, whether by accident or design. But again, the question returned, who sealed the hatch? That's when Oliver Jensen, the boy, who had first sent the drone into the silo, made an unexpected comment. While reviewing his footage again, he noticed something strange, an odd shimmer on the interior wall of the silo, only visible when the drone passed a particular angle. The sheriff brought in crime scene experts who carefully examined that portion of the structure and found beneath chipped layers of rust a message scrawled faintly in red paint. Forgive me, I couldn't let them go. That changed everything. Now the theory evolved. Perhaps the boys had died accidentally, suffocation, dehydration, or a fall inside the silo. And Ray, racked with guilt, sealed the silo himself. He didn't call police. He didn't tell a soul. Instead, he built a quiet life around a terrible secret, living just down the street from the grieving parents. The town of Rockford was stunned. People who remembered Ray now speculated endlessly. Had he shown signs of instability? Had anyone noticed the boys lingering near his property in those final days? Jenny couldn't sleep. Her dreams were filled with echoes, 3 boys calling her from inside metal walls. Frank grew withdrawn, visiting the silo daily, sitting in the grass like a watchman. One afternoon, he found a child's bracelet half buried in the dirt, a plastic charm bracelet Jenny had made with Caleb during craft day at the library. He clutched it in his fist and wept. The Peterson landowners, feeling the weight of the tragedy, allowed Jenny and Frank to fence off the area and plant a small grove of trees in memory of the boys. 3 oak saplings were planted near the base of the silo. Beneath each tree, Jenny buried a note addressed to her sons. I don't know what happened inside that place, she wrote. But I hope you knew, even in the dark, that we never stopped looking. In the weeks that followed, the shrine discovery, national media descended on Rockford. The mystery of the 3 missing brothers had become a sensation. CNN, Dateline, and even foreign outlets all came calling. But for Jenny and Frank, the coverage felt like a double-edged sword. While attention brought new eyes and resources to the case, it also reopened old wounds. Strangers debated their parenting, rehashed speculation, and sometimes suggested cruel theories. Despite that, the investigation intensified. Law enforcement began re-interviewing everyone who had lived within a 5-mile radius of the Miller home in 2001. They uncovered forgotten tips, some dismissed. At the time, a neighbor saw a brown pickup truck near the grain silo that afternoon. Someone else remembered hearing banging metal late that night. And one teenager at the time claimed he'd seen Caleb arguing with a man in overalls outside the general store. All of it seemed to point back to Ray Halberd. But there was one nagging inconsistency: the hatch. Investigators noted it was not only welded shut from the outside, it had been done professionally. The seams were sealed cleanly, tightly, as if using tools Ray may not have had access to. And the door itself had been reinforced with additional rivets, ones too new to have been original to the structure. That suggested someone returned after the boys were placed inside. Who would do that, and why? Frank brought this up with Sheriff Darnell, who confided that the case had quietly expanded. Not just into Ray's actions, but into Ray's brother Matthew Halberd, a man with a criminal history and a past most in Rockford didn't know existed. Matthew had done time in Nevada for burglary and impersonating a federal officer. He was known to move often, never staying in one place too long. During the summer of 2001, Matthew had been living just outside Rockford, staying in a shed behind Ray's home. Ray had never mentioned a brother to the Millers. But Jenny recalled seeing a man who resembled Ray, thinner, paler, lurking behind the hardware store weeks before the boys vanished. Investigators soon learned that Matthew Halberd had inherited several of Ray's possessions after his death, including a keyring. One of the keys they believed opened the hatch at the silo. Detectives tracked Matthew to a rundown cabin in the Ozarks. When confronted, he was cagey but not overtly hostile. He denied knowing anything about the boys, claimed the key was for an old generator shed, but when police obtained a search warrant, they found a disturbing cache of belongings, Polaroids of children at playgrounds, school newsletters from Iowa towns, and an envelope labeled R. Inside was a letter written by Ray. "You said you'd fix it. You promised. I never wanted this. I begged you to go to the police. You said it was too late. You said they'd all blame me. But now I dream of them every night. Their voices in the silo. Please make it right. Or I will." That letter changed everything. Now investigators had a working theory Ray had accidentally, or intentionally, lured the boys into the silo. Perhaps it was meant to be a prank. Perhaps something went wrong. But it was Matthew, the more dangerous brother, who had returned days later, found them still alive or already gone, and decided to seal the hatch permanently. Whether out of guilt or an effort to cover up the mistake, Matthew took control of the scene. Ray, too weak or terrified to object, allowed it. The shrine, the message, the secrecy. It all pointed to a deeply broken dynamic between the two brothers. The sheriff's office issued a formal statement naming Matthew Halberd a person of interest in the presumed deaths of the Miller boys. The public reaction was swift and brutal. His cabin was vandalized. He disappeared 3 days later. For Jenny and Frank, it felt like reliving the nightmare all over again. "I thought we were close to peace," Jenny whispered one morning, sipping tea on their back porch. "But now it's like we're back to the beginning," Frank nodded. "Except now we know someone could have saved them, and didn't." 1 week later, a hiker stumbled upon a new piece of evidence, a half-buried milk crate in the woods 10 miles from the silo. Inside were plastic containers labeled lunch, CN gum, EN and games, JN. Initials Caleb Elijah Jonah. The containers were cracked and weathered, but forensic testing confirmed fingerprints on one of them matched Jonah Miller. The boys had been alive after their disappearance, at least for a time. That detail devastated Jenny. She spent nights rereading the old birthday cards they'd drawn the pages of their shared adventure book, and Caleb's last scribbled note. "We're going to build a fort. Can we keep it secret?" The boys had trusted someone enough to follow them. That trust had been betrayed. Detectives published a digital age progression rendering of what the boys would have looked like at ages 30, 29, and 27. It was released nationwide. Billboards went up. A podcast featuring the Miller story became one of the most downloaded true crime series of the year. Still no bodies, but something deeper had been uncovered, a dark legacy of silence, manipulation, and deception. The Miller boys had become more than a local mystery. They were now a symbol of small-town tragedies that go unsolved far too long. And the silo stood there, still rusted, silent, and hollow. But not forgotten. The discovery of the lunch containers reignited both the investigation and the Millers' hope, though. Hope now took a different shape. Jenny no longer believed her boys were alive, but she clung to the idea that some part of their story still remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Frank, ever the pragmatist, focused on closure. If there were remains to be found, he wanted them laid to rest. The police doubled down. They re-interviewed everyone who had worked with Ray Halberd or had known his brother Matthew. One such person was Glenna Sharp, a former clerk at a gas station near the edge of town. She claimed Matthew had stopped by frequently in 2001, often buying bulk gasoline and tinned food. But one detail stuck out: he always paid in coins. She remembered it because the boys' faces were on missing flyers taped beside the register, and she swore she once saw a small pair of sneakers in the back of his van. Investigators traced the van, long since junked and compacted at a scrapyard. Nothing usable remained. Jenny and Frank, meanwhile, had grown closer than ever in their grief, channeling their energy into a foundation they'd started, the Miller 3 Project. It was designed to support families of long-term missing children and to raise money for forensic efforts in cold cases. Though emotionally exhausted, they found a strange sense of purpose in telling their story. Then came a breakthrough. A local boy named Drew, 15 years old, quiet, the son of a construction worker, confessed to his school counselor that his father had dug up old bones last summer and burned them. At first, it sounded like the product of an overactive imagination, but after Child Protective Services got involved, they interviewed the father, Mark Travers, a man who'd bought Ray Halberd's former home in 2017. He admitted to burning things, but not bones. Old trash paint cans, junk from the basement, he claimed. But a warrant was issued anyway. The fireplace in the back of the Travers home, still the original chimney from when Ray owned the house, was examined by forensic techs. Within hours, they confirmed it human remains, specifically burned fragments of finger bones and part of a juvenile mandible. DNA extracted matched Jonah Miller. The revelation shattered Jenny and Frank. Not one of them made it, Jenny whispered when she was told. He was the youngest. It begged the question, were all 3 boys killed and burned there? Or had only one of them ended up in that fireplace? Investigators combed the surrounding grounds. They discovered additional bone fragments in a dry well behind the shed. More tests confirmed at least 2 distinct individuals, Jonah and Caleb. But Elijah's DNA remained absent. That posed another possibility: could Elijah have escaped? It seemed far-fetched. But then another clue emerged. Tucked behind a loose board in the shed, where Matthew had once lived, was a weather-worn notebook. Pages had stuck together with mold, but one page stood out protected by a plastic sandwich bag. It read, "I am Elijah. I saw what they did. I can't speak anymore. I'm sorry." The handwriting was shaky, as though from someone injured or young. Jenny broke down when she read it. Elijah saw them hurt his brothers, she said through tears. He survived. At least for a little while. The page was dated December 12, 2001, nearly 3 weeks after the boys had disappeared. That changed the narrative again. Elijah had been alive, hidden, or held after his brothers were gone. The note gave hope, but also introduced chilling implications: who had kept him alive? Why couldn't he speak, and what happened to him afterward? With no evidence Elijah had ever left, Rockford detectives focused on Matthew's known associates. One name surfaced: Bryce Vinton, an unlicensed taxidermist who once worked at a bait shop outside town. He'd been friends with Matthew and had a disturbing criminal record involving cruelty to animals. Bryce had died in 2007 from a heart attack. His property had since been abandoned. Investigators searched it and found multiple mementos: school ID badges, candy wrappers, Polaroids, but none conclusively linked to Elijah. One thing did stand out, however: a map. Hand-drawn, marked with a red circle over a location just north of the Mississippi River. It showed a storage locker facility. Authorities quickly secured a search warrant. Inside the locker was only one thing: a red metal trunk. Its lock was broken with a crowbar. Inside, buried beneath layers of moldy blankets, were more of Elijah's belongings: his soccer jersey, his laminated library card, and heartbreakingly, a folded drawing of his family, all smiling under the words, "I'll come home soon." but no remains. Jenny didn't know whether to feel relief or anguish. He may have lived longer than we thought, she whispered. But where did he go after this? The search for Elijah, now believed to have outlived his brothers by weeks, perhaps months, took on new urgency. Detectives traced the storage unit lease back to a false name, but handwriting experts linked the signature to Matthew Halberd. No one knew how far his influence went, how many others he'd manipulated, what other truths still lay buried. Back at the Miller house, Jenny sat in what had once been the boys' shared bedroom. The adventure book lay in her lap. She traced Caleb's messy block letters, Elijah's loops, Jonah's crooked hearts. She whispered their names one after the other. "I will find all of you, I promise." Elijah's trace at the storage unit ignited media attention across the Midwest. Missing posters with age progression renderings appeared again in shop windows, gas stations, and post offices. Jenny and Frank appeared on national morning shows, describing the latest discoveries and their renewed search for answers. But deep down, the couple knew the investigation was entering more dangerous emotional territory. If Elijah had survived months after the disappearance, where did his trail end, and why? The map in the trunk had a small X drawn a few miles from the storage facility. Detectives canvassed the area and quickly discovered what the red marker was meant to indicate: a long abandoned farmhouse, half sunken into the surrounding cornfields. The county records showed it had been unoccupied since the early 1980s, left to rot after a fire gutted the main floor. No official connection linked Matthew Halberd or Bryce Vinton to the property. But a closer inspection revealed telltale signs of habitation: old soda cans, dirty sleeping bags, broken toys, and empty canned food stacked inside a blackened cupboard. What truly made everyone pause, however, was a message scrawled on the basement wall in red chalk: "Still waiting. Don't forget me." The handwriting matched the note previously found in the shed. Forensic experts confirmed it. Elijah had likely written this, and based on the style and chalk analysis, it may have been left there months after the date on the original diary page. That meant Elijah could have been alive well into 2002, maybe even longer. Detectives began to theorize that Elijah had been kept in a loop of captivity, moved between places by one or more of Matthew's unknown accomplices. There were even whispers that he might have been trafficked, though the family refused to speak that word aloud. Meanwhile, a former FBI profiler named Maureen Baines joined the case after hearing about it on the news. She specialized in long-term child abduction patterns and had consulted on similar missing persons cases. Reviewing the evidence, she noticed something odd. Each location Elijah had possibly been kept: Ray Halberd's house, Bryce Vinton's land, the storage facility, and now the farmhouse, all fell within a 30-mile radius of Rockford. There was no attempt to move Elijah far from his hometown. Someone wanted him nearby, Maureen said. This wasn't just about hiding. It was about control. She also pointed out another chilling pattern: all of these properties had one thing in common: proximity to water. Halberd's home was near a creek. Vinton's storage unit backed against a canal. The farmhouse had a well long dry but once active. Maureen suspected this wasn't coincidence. Aerial drone surveys of the area around the farmhouse were ordered. Thermal imaging found anomalies: underground old tunnels from a mining operation, long sealed in the early 20th century. Local teens knew of these tunnels but rarely explored them due to cave-ins and rumors of haunting. Detectives joined by urban explorers and cadaver dogs entered the tunnels cautiously. For 2 days, they mapped and cataloged rooms dug into the walls. Some were animal burrows, others simply collapsed. But one chamber stood out. Roughly 20 feet into a tunnel beneath the farmhouse, they found a room carved out with unusual symmetry. It was about the size of a child's bedroom, with shelves carved into the walls, graffiti etched into the stone. A child's drawings still clung to the damp rock stick figures' sons' names. In one corner they found a child's sleeping bag and a rusted lantern, and next to it an unmarked grave. Excavation took hours. Eventually, they unearthed a set of human remains, small, incomplete. Forensic experts confirmed through dental records it was Elijah. Jenny and Frank were told late at night. Jenny cried in silence while Frank walked out into their backyard and stayed there until morning. After 22 years, they finally had answers to the fate of all three boys. But new questions began to fester almost immediately. Elijah had survived weeks, maybe months, and had been kept in a small underground chamber carved into a forgotten tunnel. Who had visited him? Who had brought him food? Who had buried him? And most chilling of all, why had no one noticed? A tiny toy train was found beside Elijah's remains. It matched one from a set the boys had received for Christmas in 2000. Jenny remembered it vividly. She had nearly stepped on it the day before the blizzard. "I put it back in their room," she whispered, when shown a photo. That meant Elijah had carried it with him through everything until the very end. The case went public once more. Vigilantes began harassing known associates of Matthew Halberd despite lack of evidence. The Miller family pleaded for peace and space, asking only that anyone with real knowledge come forward. And then 2 weeks later, someone did. A man named Stanley Keever, a former custodian who had worked at Rockford Elementary in 2001, walked into the police station and asked to speak with the lead detective. He said only one thing: "I saw the van. I saw the kids. I should have said something." Stanley Keever sat stiffly in the interrogation room, the low hum of the overhead light buzzing just above his thinning gray hair. He gripped a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee untouched. Across the table, detectives Rachel Lewin and Ted Granger exchanged a glance before pressing the recorder button. "You said you saw the van, Mr. Keever," Rachel began gently. Stanley nodded. It was a blue Chevy, rusted dented on the passenger side. "I saw it parked near the back lot by the school the day those boys disappeared." Granger leaned forward. "You worked maintenance. What were you doing outside at that time?" "Snow had started falling early," Stanley said. "I was salting the back steps. Slippery. Didn't want the kids to fall." "And the van," Rachel pressed. "It was idling. I thought maybe it was a parent waiting. But then I saw someone open the back. Not the driver, someone came around. Big guy, heavy coat. I couldn't see his face. But he put someone into the back." "You saw a child being taken?" "I think so. It happened so fast. I didn't want to assume anything." "Back then, you didn't jump to conclusions. Especially not with someone you didn't know." "I told myself it was just roughhousing." "And did you report it?" Stanley shook his head, shame flushing his cheeks. "No, I didn't want to get involved." The detectives thanked him and showed him photographs. He pointed hesitantly to Matthew Halberd's image. That might be him. Or maybe the other man. He had that same build. His testimony, though not definitive, added one more piece to the timeline. It placed the boys alive and near the school during the first wave of confusion, and possibly in contact with an accomplice before being moved. The reawakened investigation now focused on the van. A DMV search of blue Chevy vans registered in the area in 2001 produced over 200 results. But one name stood out: James Arkwell. He was Bryce Vinton's cousin and had lived just 3 blocks from the Millers at the time. Arkwell had never been questioned in the original investigation. His name had never come up. The detectives paid him a visit. He was now living alone in a rural trailer park in southern Iowa under a different name. When asked about the van, he first denied owning it. But after being shown registration and sale documents, he admitted it. "I sold it in '03, he said. Didn't run well in the cold." Rachel asked if he remembered where he'd been on January 17, 2001. He said no. They showed him photographs of the boys. He went quiet. "Did you help Matthew Halberd move them?" "I didn't know what was happening," he finally said. "He just said he needed help lifting furniture." Then, then I saw the boys. He said they were runaways, that their parents didn't want them, that they'd be safer away from home. And you believed that. I was young and stupid. Detectives seized his property and found more than just memories. In a crawl space under his trailer, they found a box of old photographs, some of Elijah, others likely taken without the family's knowledge. There was one particularly haunting image: Elijah sitting on the floor of what appeared to be the farmhouse basement, holding the toy train. The timestamp was April 2001. Elijah had lived for at least 3 months after his brothers were likely gone. The case reached a breaking point. Arkwell was arrested, charged with kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and accessory to murder. He pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, revealing horrifying details. He confirmed that Matthew had orchestrated the abduction initially as a twisted act of rebellion against society's rules. Halberd had wanted to raise the boys on his own, convinced he could mold them into something pure, something better. But it hadn't gone to plan. Jacob had fought back. He'd tried to escape, and according to Arkwell's account, was taken care of by Bryce Vinton in a fit of rage. Samuel, the youngest, died from an untreated infection weeks later. Only Elijah had survived longest. Matthew kept him hidden, fed him stories about his parents abandoning him, that they'd given him away. The boy, confused and traumatized, retreated inward. Eventually, Halberd became paranoid. He moved Elijah to the tunnels and instructed Arkwell to bury the boy there after a bad fall. He didn't die immediately. Arkwell admitted he'd left him alive, injured, and afraid. Frank couldn't bear to listen to the details in court. Jenny, however, sat through every testimony, every confession, her jaw clenched, hands clenched tighter. When Arkwell was sentenced to life in prison, she stared directly into his eyes. "You left him in the dark," she whispered. And now the public knew the truth. The brothers had not vanished without a trace. They had been taken hidden in plain sight, moved between familiar locations, abused, and ultimately discarded. Their memory was honored with a public memorial near the school, where a statue now stands, 3 boys with bicycles frozen mid-laugh. But for the Millers, closure remained elusive. "I don't feel peace," Frank admitted during an interview, "but I feel something else. I feel like I can breathe." As for Jenny, she began volunteering with organizations dedicated to locating missing children. She carried Elijah's drawing, copied from the basement wall, in her wallet. "Still waiting. Don't forget me." They never would. Spring returned to Dairy Ridge in cautious steps, buds on trees, muddy boots, and sunlight reluctant to linger. Yet for the first time in 22 years, it brought something else to exhumation. At a private ceremony at Roseview Cemetery, the Miller family reburied their sons, at least what could be recovered. A coroner's report confirmed the fragmentary remains belonged to Jacob and Samuel, identified through mitochondrial DNA. Elijah's bones, though incomplete, matched the timeline injuries and remaining material from the tunnel shaft. Each coffin was the same size, small and white, laid beside each other under the old oak tree behind the family plot. The wind rustled like whispers. Dozens came: neighbors, former classmates, rescue volunteers who'd searched 2 decades ago. The church bell tolled 3 times. Frank stood, one hand on Jenny's shoulder. Her gaze never wavered. Beside the graves were 3 bicycles, rusted, cleaned, and chained gently to a new wrought iron fence. The very ones found inside the grain silo. A symbol of the journey they'd never finished. But the story wasn't over. The investigators, now armed with Arkwell's confession, reopened a dormant case file, a missing girl from Lincoln in 2002. Arkwell had made an offhand comment about not being his first. That slip reignited multiple unsolved disappearances along rural Nebraska corridors. Files from other counties surfaced. In total, 5 other children, ages 8 to 13, had gone missing in similar patterns. None had been connected until now. Arkwell refused to elaborate. He claimed no knowledge, but his digital footprint betrayed him. In a forgotten email archive, they found encrypted images and metadata pointing to old addresses linked to Halberd and Vinton, photographs of children, coordinates, barns, sheds, woods. It seemed the Millers were not the only family shattered. FBI agents moved in, mapping the old network. They raided a property in South Dakota, where they found an underground space long abandoned. Chains embedded in cement, a dusty mattress, and child-sized shoes. The horror deepened. What had begun as a family's personal nightmare now emerged as the tip of a sickening network. Not organized crime, but a cluster of broken men, disillusioned, embittered, and deluded, who preyed on innocence under the guise of ideological purity. Matthew Halberd's writings became critical. He'd kept journals, manifestos really about re-education, obedience, and the cleansing of lies children were taught. His ramblings were incoherent at times, apocalyptic in tone, but they painted a portrait of obsession. Of a man who believed he was saving the boys he stole. In the final pages of one journal, found buried in a sealed tin beneath his fireplace, was a letter. Elijah is different. He still laughs, still dreams. I fear he knows the truth. I cannot protect him from the world anymore, only from its memory. If they find this place, they'll know. They'll see what I built. I only ever wanted to save one. Investigators believed this letter marked the beginning of the end for Elijah. Halberd's paranoia mixed with his sense of ownership became lethal when the illusion cracked. The fall that led to Elijah's final days was likely not an accident. One final discovery broke the case wide open, a list of initials scratched into Halberd's basement wall. 25 names. Some matched known missing children. Some did not. It would take years to cross-reference them all. But for now, for Frank and Jenny, the three mattered most. That summer, the family released a memoir, 3 Wheels Missing, chronicling the 2-decade search and the harrowing revelations that followed. The book spent 8 weeks on the bestseller list, not for sensationalism, but for the quiet, enduring grief it honored. It became a touchstone for other parents still searching. One passage from Jenny's chapter stood out. I used to wonder if the silence meant they were gone. But now I know sometimes silence means someone is trying to speak from very far away. We just weren't listening hard enough. In their backyard, Frank built a garden. At the center, 3 trees stood, one for each son. Under Elijah's tree, a small bronze plaque read, "He waited, and we came." As the town healed, life crept back in. The school was rebuilt, its name rededicated to the brothers. A small museum exhibit in the town hall preserved the story, bicycles, drawings, newspaper clippings, even the grain silo's rusted panel. Not to glorify the horror, but to remember. Dairy Ridge had changed. The wound would never fully close, but sunlight reached parts of it now. In late fall, Jenny visited the tunnel alone. The vines had been cleared, the entry sealed. But she knelt at the spot and left something, a toy train identical to the one Elijah had drawn. She sat in the silence a long time, and then she whispered, "I hear you." In the months following the burial and the revelations that accompanied it, the town of Dairy Ridge began to undergo a subtle transformation. What had once been a sleepy farming community was now a place marked by memory, by vigilance, and oddly by purpose. People paid more attention to their children, their neighbors, and to silence. Law enforcement maintained an active presence in the region. The grain silo had been fenced off and declared a crime scene, though the structure itself was slated for demolition. Local kids no longer wandered off unsupervised, and stranger danger took on a renewed, painfully real context. Teachers, parents, and even grocery clerks seemed bound by an unspoken promise this must never happen again. Frank and Jenny Miller, though quietly grieving, found themselves pulled back into a life of momentum. They were no longer just parents of the missing, they were advocates. Journalists began contacting them from across the country. A podcast series chronicling the Miller disappearance became a hit. The couple had mixed feelings about the attention. Frank often bristled at the dramatization, but Jenny understood the importance. "If our boys can help keep someone else safe," she said once during a TV interview, "then their story matters beyond us." It was in that spirit that Jenny began organizing a local memorial conference. She partnered with law enforcement, missing persons foundations, and trauma counselors. The event, called Still Searching, invited families from across the Midwest who had experienced similar disappearances. The town hosted vigils panels and workshops on child safety and rural search techniques. One of the most anticipated guests was a woman named Renee Tiller, whose daughter vanished from Missouri in 2005. She spoke during the closing night beside Jenny in the town square under a string of soft lights. People wept, some for the first time. But amidst healing, another strange thread emerged. An anonymous letter arrived at the Dairy Ridge Sheriff's Office in late September. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. The envelope contained one sentence clipped from a magazine. "You found the bikes, but not all the riders." The letter had no return address. The postmark was from Omaha. Detectives took it seriously. Though the remains in the grain silo and tunnel had been confirmed as the three brothers, the suggestion of a fourth boy, another child potentially connected, threw the entire case back into flux. Cross-checking Halberd's journals again revealed that in a few cryptic passages, he'd referenced a Marcus, though no child by that name was ever reported missing in connection to the others. But perhaps Marcus was a pseudonym, or perhaps someone else had been with them, or worse still, alive. The silo was re-examined, this time with ground-penetrating radar. Investigators found no new remains, but in a buried section beneath a cement slab they hadn't tested before, they discovered something startling: a child's shoe wrapped in plastic and sealed in a box marked with duct tape. Inside the shoe was a note, smudged and barely legible, written in pencil. "He said we would go home soon. I'm not sure he means it." DNA from the shoe did not match any of the Miller boys. The story deepened, and with it, the horror. The community, now fully invested, funded a full forensic dig around the old Halberd property, where new evidence emerged: finger bones, more drawings, a belt with a school ID tag still clipped to it, M. Loring. Records from Iowa confirmed that a Mark Loring, age 10, had gone missing in 1999 while riding his bike through rural grain fields near Ottumwa. His case had never been connected to the Miller case, but now with the physical evidence it was clear he'd somehow ended up in Halberd's world. Frank and Jenny, already overwhelmed by the painful discoveries surrounding their own sons, now found themselves emotionally tethered to Mark's parents, who flew in to visit the Miller home. They sat together on the porch, not as strangers, but as members of a fraternity no one would ever choose. For all the horror, something extraordinary began to happen. People cared. The media didn't just gawk, they investigated. Authorities didn't just file reports, they searched again. And across the nation, cold cases that had once been written off as runaways were revisited, in part because of what happened in Dairy Ridge. A local college professor began compiling a database of rural child disappearances from 1970 to 2010. She found disturbing overlaps: regions where no active predators had been suspected, but where patterns of missing children matched eerily with the ideology found in Halberd's writings. A documentary crew soon arrived in town. They offered the Millers full editorial control. Frank initially declined, but Jenny, her voice steadier now than it had ever been, agreed. "It's time we show the world what hiding really looks like." As winter approached, the final forensic results from the Halberd farm came in. The bones beneath the silo slab were confirmed to be from two different children: Mark Loring and an unknown second boy, identity still pending. The FBI now believed Halberd was part of a loosely connected network spanning at least 4 states. Possibly more. One surviving boy might still be out there. The press dubbed him the Fourth Shadow. The Miller house became a symbol not of tragedy, but of attention. A wooden sculpture of three boys on bicycles was installed at the base of the grain silo. Each bike pointed in a different direction, and beneath them, etched in stone, was the line. They were taken in silence. They returned in storm. As spring settled over Dairy Ridge, the farmland began to stir back to life. New buds sprouting on branches, tractors cutting furrows through thawed earth, and sunlight spilling across silos that now stood more as reminders than tools. But within the Miller home and the broader hearts of the town, something had shifted irreversibly. The silence that once followed the boys' disappearance had been replaced with questions. Questions that refused to fade, that poked holes in old assumptions. The fourth shadow theory gripped the public's attention. News anchors speculated on morning television. Reddit threads ran for miles with amateur sleuths connecting names and symbols across decades. Even the FBI, typically tight-lipped, released an unusual statement. "We believe this is not the end of the story." With the discovery of the bones believed to be Mark Loring's and another unidentified child, national attention poured into Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, and Kansas. Victims' families who had long since given up hope were suddenly being called again by investigators. "We're reopening your file," they were told. "We may have found a link." Halberd's journals became the centerpiece of those connections. Though fragmented, they revealed more than one would expect. Meticulously kept their pages detailed, not just his actions, but his warped beliefs. He wrote of preserving purity, of freeing the spirits of boys before they are consumed by the world. One passage referenced the ceremony in the field, and another mentioned the witness boy who couldn't cry. No one knew if that boy was real. If he lived, if he had grown into a man somewhere carrying unspeakable scars. Or if perhaps he had not made it out at all. But the letter from Omaha haunted law enforcement. It was reanalyzed, scanned for fingerprints, and dissected by forensic linguists. The odd phrasing, "You found the bikes, but not all the riders," was unlike anything Halberd had written. Could it have been from another participant, a survivor, a copycat? In the meantime, the community of Dairy Ridge did not wait for the government to fix everything. They held monthly candlelight walks that began at the edge of the old farm and ended at the town library, where an entire section had been dedicated to missing persons. Not just the Miller boys and Mark Loring, but others from across the country. Names that had once been whispered became spoken aloud with reverence. Jenny started a blog. It became a quiet phenomenon. She wrote not about grief, but about presence, how to be with others in their pain, how to listen, how to hold space for the unknown. Her posts were raw, rarely edited, but they sparked something. Other parents began writing back. Frank returned to woodworking. He carved little figurines, three boys on bikes, a wheat field, a grain silo with a broken door, and began mailing them to families of the missing. No note. Just a symbol that someone remembered. And then, in June, 23 years to the day since the boys had vanished, another envelope arrived. This time at the Miller's home. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed a dirt path running through a cornfield likely taken in late summer. The edges were yellowed and someone had scribbled on the back, "He ran. He might have made it." ML tried. Detectives analyzed it immediately, but results were inconclusive. Still, the image took on a life of its own. It was uploaded to missing person forums, dissected in documentaries, debated by podcasters. A crowdfunding campaign raised enough money to fully excavate the surrounding land where Halberd had lived. They uncovered more journals damaged by weather and a buried box containing rusted tools and cassette tapes. One tape was salvageable. The recording was faint, but clear enough to distinguish three voices. Young boys. The static of a radio in the background. A man's voice interrupts with instructions. Then silence. Then something else, a soft voice whispering, "Don't let him see you." It was chilling, but it was also a spark. That summer, the FBI confirmed that 6 more disappearances from 1997-2003 bore similarities to the Miller case. 5 of them involved boys under 13. 4 had last been seen on bicycles. All of them occurred within 150 miles of Derry Ridge. Public pressure mounted. Federal hearings were proposed to explore failures in communication between jurisdictions. State senators visited Derry Ridge promising reform. And still in the back of everyone's mind was the same question. What if one of them got away? What if the fourth shadow was out there watching, surviving, remembering? 1 year after the boys were laid to rest, Jenny and Frank returned to the grain silo with dozens of supporters. A plaque had been installed, etched with all 4 names, Luke, Aaron, Seth, and Mark. A small gap remained beneath, reserved for name unknown. Jenny read aloud from a poem she had written. We lost them to silence, to stillness, to soil. But they left behind echoes in every corn husk, every bike tire spinning alone, and in the voice of the boy who may yet speak. Frank simply placed 3 roses at the base of the sculpture. Then turning to the crowd, he said, "If one more child is saved by this story, then our boys live again." And for that moment in the golden hush of dusk, the town stood still. Not in fear, but in remembrance. And in that space where sorrow had lived for 2 decades, something else began to bloom hope.